Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Currott Writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 1998 romantic comedy fantasy film titled Practical Magic. Now, Practical Magic runs for 1 hour and 44 minutes long. It is directed by Griffin Dunne. It is produced by Denise Denovi. The script was written by Robin Swicord, Akiva Goldsman, and Adam Brooks. The score was done by Alan Silvestri, the cinematography by Andrew Dunne, and it was edited by Elizabeth Kling. And the stars of the movie are Sandra Bullock as Sally Owens, Nicole Kidman as Jillian Owens. Their younger versions were played by, respectively, by Camilla, Belle, and Laura Ann Criswell. Also joining the cast is Stockard Channing, Dianne Wiest, Goran Visnjic. We also have Aidan, Quinn, Caprice, Benedetti. We have a very, very young Evan Rachel Wood. Also joining the cast includes the guy who seems to be in one failed sitcom after another. Maybe the guy could be also labeled as sitcom poison. No, I'm just joking. We respect him. I don't think it's his fault that the sitcoms that he's in usually never come out successful. Maybe it's just the shows that he signs himself on. Maybe he doesn't make really good career decisions, but I'm not putting him down in any way, shape, or form, or shaming him. It's not probably his fault. It's just bad karma, I suppose. I'm talking about Mark Feuerstein. Also joining the cast includes Chloe Webb, Lucinda Janney, Margo Martindale, and Martha Gehman. In the realms of the atmosphere that surrounds this movie in 1998, practical magic, the girls, the ladies, the older ladies, the witches, and even Mother Earth has all the power and magic to lure you into their lives as they cast a spell on each of us to watch this film. The good does outweigh the bad here, due to the two mega superstar actresses sharing the spotlight with each other, working well together without one trying to usurp the other. Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman shine as the Owens sisters, Sally and Jillian, who have a special bond for each other and come from a long line of witches with the gift of magic that has passed on to them, and a curse that was given not to them, but to the men they fall in love, or the men who fall in love with them. Yes, I know when it comes to all good gifts, it also comes at a price that's not necessarily consequential to them, but to the men in their lives. Stockard Channing and Dianne Wiest show some great supporting turns as they play their aunts who enjoy casting spells and also seems to have a knack for offering chocolate cake for breakfast for the sisters. The Owen sisters seem to have had a generation of traditions passed on to them. Of course, it's going to play off with a little bit of cliche, being that once again, this is another one of these witching stories, and I guess it just doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure out the exact location as to where this movie takes place, huh? You guessed it! You are going back to Massachusetts. Do all of the things I used to do. And the lights All come down to Massachusetts. Alright, I'm gonna stop singing. I guess you kinda know that this movie is, of course, going to take place in Massachusetts. I mean, where's the rocket science behind that, huh? Okay, all kidding aside, but it's like every witch-themed movie or TV series seems to like to take place in Massachusetts, or at least upstate New York. Because, of course, we all know that anything that comes with witches is synonymous with the Salem witch trials. And, of course, you know, the Witches of Eastwick took place in Massachusetts. Small town, conservative Massachusetts. The series Charmed took place in Massachusetts. So what makes practical magic any different? It's going to take place in small town, conservative Massachusetts. And I'm sorry I murdered the Bee Gees song. I hope Robin and Morris are not rolling in their graves. Alright, enough of that. In fact, you know, maybe throughout this whole movie, I'm probably going to make some comparisons between the Witches of Eastwick and practical magic as I go along. Okay. And, yeah, I mean, I got to admit, I mean, this is a really well-acted film. I mean, being the fact that we have a couple of two great Academy Award-winning actresses like Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman, Stockard, Channing, Dianne Wiest are also up there. Dianne Wiest too, I believe she won an Oscar. So we have a few great esteemed performers here. Stockard Channing, you know, she's been around a long time. Of course, her best role I remember her is Rizzo from the 1978 movie Grease, but she's done a lot of other stuff too. Yeah, I mean, they seem like pretty cool ants. I mean, who doesn't want chocolate cake for breakfast? Anyhow, yeah, of course, you know, when it comes to witches, you know, they may have the gift and the talents to perform magic and hexes and whatnot. But of course, it also comes with a curse, which actually goes to show you that whatever comes with a blessing can also come with a curse. Apparently, the men in their lives, well, fate seems to happen to them. Also, another interesting note is that in the Owens residence, they can't produce sons. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, all depends on a person's personal point of view. But I will get a little bit more into that as I expand. And sure, the spellbinding action and the whimsical moments are at the peak of what makes this movie heavily entertaining. You just feel you wish you would expect Jack Nicholson to reprise his role as Daryl Van Horn as they come at them and play seductive mind games with the characters, particularly Sally and Gillian Owens, of course, you know, like I mentioned before, Bullock and Kidman. Because let's face it, you know, if there is a weakness in this movie, it's just that the main bad guy in this movie just does not have the same charm and appeal and charisma that Jack Nicholson had in The Witches of Eastwick. I mean, in The Witches of Eastwick, Jack Nicholson, you know, he was just, you know, like on fire. I mean, this guy was convincing as the devil. And he just, you know, even though he was the villain in this story, he was like really magnetic and he was the most interesting character in this movie. In this movie, the villain, played by Goran Visnjic, well, obviously, you know, his English is limited, his speaking lines are limited, but he just does not have that same kind of appeal to be a convincing villain for the Owen sisters. In fact, he does not, I don't think he actually even possesses any kind of imminent threat like what Jack Nicholson's character had on the three witches in The Witches of Eastwick. I mean, this is where the biggest weakness in this movie stems from. Alright, oh, I forgot to mention, this is, of course, adapted from a novel in 1995 by Alice Hoffman, also called Practical Magic. It explores not just the world of fictional witchcraft, both the light side and the dark ones, but it also has certain elements of drama that definitely deals with real issues that the women are affected by. I mean, in this movie, Sandra Bullock's character, for the most run, is actually a very miserable wreck. And even though even though she should be happy that she's got the gift of the gab and that she comes from a long line of traditional witches, she really doesn't want part of it. She just wants to live a normal, happy life. And one of the big issues in this movie that really makes this movie tug at your heartstrings is the subject of commitment. She eventually does actually find the man of her life, and then she kind of like breaks away from her sister and her aunts who have raised them like daughters. She goes out, she gets married to this guy. He seems like a pretty, cool individual. They have a house of their own. They have, of course, two daughters because, like I said, the Owens children can't produce sons. But that's beside the point. They seem to. We're just all happy that she actually found some sort of happiness within her life. But then, of course, tragedy comes, her husband dies, and then all of a sudden, she just goes into deep-rooted depression, which is something that you don't see very much in The Witches of Eastwick because, even though a lot of the three witches in the story, Alex, Jane, and Suki, they all are also widowed individuals. One, her husband's dead, one divorced her because she can't make children, and one divorced the other because she just doesn't seem to know how a condom operates. There is some dramatic elements in The Witches of Eastwick, but it's mostly played off mostly for the horror fantasy elements. This one actually has much more human drama in this movie, which makes it a little bit more effective and maybe even a little more believable in its content. Commitments comes in, abuse, eventually I think one of the witches eventually marries somebody, but then he eventually he dies. He comes back to life as a demonic entity, only to be defeated again. Let's see, trying to fit into society, whereas in The Witches of Eastwick, Alex, Jane, and Suki, they try to fit in with society. But then eventually they realize that, maybe being outsiders is more of a blessing than a hindrance. Whereas, in the case of Sally and Jillian, especially Sally, they want to live normal lives. They want to fit into society. Of course, they live in Massachusetts, small town Massachusetts, which is very, very uber conservative. And the people around them just can't accept or approve of them because they are still witches. But most people who wish to see it don't care about all that. If you're going to go in and watch a witch-themed movie, people just want to see magic. They want to see hexes. They want to see spellbind. They want to see mind games. And the epic climax between good and evil. I mean, you do get that in this movie, but the movie kind of plays more closer to almost like a romantic comedy with witchcraft in it, which probably kind of makes sense because, back in the 90s, Sandra Bullock was in a whole slew full of romantic comedies. And, rightful, and I guess this kind of made sense with her back then because, back then she was pretty much well into her 30s. And, romantic comedies was pretty big in the 90s. Of course, these days, romantic comedies are not really touched upon too much these days because most female characters in movies these days want to just go out and kick ass and shoot people, for girl power and empowerment. Well, you do find some girl power in the movie Practical Magic, but not in an over the top sense and not really like ham-fisted shove down our throats type of thing. There is some feminist elements into this movie, but it's not like overkill or to the point where it's like they hate men. There's no male hating in this movie. In fact, these girls would love to have somebody in their lives who are not going to fall into some kind of evil curse that has been passed down to them for generations. And they're not going to be like the characters from The Witches of Eastwick who decide, hey, we don't need a man in our lives. We can raise our children on our own without anybody. And they just learn to just accept themselves as outsiders. Whereas in the movie Practical Magic, they never give up trying to find a person in their lives. But underneath all the magic, hexes, and warcrafts, there's also a lot of love story that comes into this movie. And it's not as fully fleshed out, and it doesn't take too much space for non-fans of romantic melodramas. Just a word of warning, when there's a full moon and someone is flying around on her broomstick, take caution. Once the broom falls, trouble is just a motion away. Now, like I said, this movie is far from perfect. It starts to go down when the situations that these characters face is where the movie starts to become quite a bit problematic. Sometimes the cliches depicted here are so corny, you can make popcorn out of all of this corniness. In one of the more cliched witch story movies, the opening scenes tend to take place in 17th century Massachusetts, where a young lady is about to be sentenced to death by hanging during the infamous Salem witch trials. Why does it always seem to happen in every fucking witch story? That we always have to find a female character who's ready to meet her unfortunate fate because of the freaking Salem witch hunts. Apparently, and just like in all typical cliched matter, she eventually resurrects as a witch, placing a curse on her family legacy, and that the women who marry will likely not have a long-lasting relationship because their husbands will die shortly. But of course, it's up to the Owen sisters to kind of put a stop to this curse. And hopefully, if they can pull through for this curse, they could probably end up having an eventful life. And probably have a happily ever after in the end. With all that said, with her powers, she managed to escape death by have the branch snap just like a twig. Also, why do these so-called witches in the Salem witch trial murders have to be so pretty? I mean, it's not like I'm complaining, but it's just so cliched. that these witches that are usually put to death are very beautiful, pretty young girls. I've always thought that witches were mean-spirited, frumpy, ugly Broomhilda types. I mean, most of the women who were executed during the Salem witch trials were downright ugly, unkept, and lived in condemned houses close to on the brink of being torn down. Why is it that in movies they insist on hanging pretty women to death? It doesn't make much sense now, does it? And then another cliche that runs rampant in movies, that there are predominant that though yeah, okay, yes, it's a predominantly female cast. Why does there always has to be a dance montage in at least one scene? Even in other predominantly female cast, we always have to have at least one dance off. The movie Mermaids has at the end, Cher, Winona Ryder, and Christina Ricci dancing to that, if you want to be happy for the rest of your life, never make a pretty woman your wife. So, from my personal point of view, get an ugly girl to marry you. You have that in that movie, and yet that movie is not even a witch-themed movie. You have dance montages in a movie like The Witches of Eastwick. You have it in other movies where it's a predominantly female cast. We always have to have at least one little dance montage. Why does it have to be like that? I mean, it's not like I'm complaining, but it just seems like it's just put in there just for the fun of it. In this case, we have the ladies pull out an old record from the 1970s, and they start dancing idiotically to the lime in the coconut song. He put the lime in the coconut and drank it all up. By, what's his name there? Harry Nilsson. I mean, do they believe that women do this when their loved ones aren't watching them? Possibly. But it just seems sort of out of place, and it looks just so freaking awkward. So, under the direction of Griffin Dunne, he makes out this movie like it's a celebration of girl power, when really he's basically clueless, and this is just there to pander to the ever-growing need for women's empowerment. Alright, he gives us, I mean, even though I didn't really say too much about the whole women's empowerment thing, it is there, it is blatant, it is obvious, and he does make too much of a big deal about it. And it sometimes gets to the point where, okay, yes, they are under threat, they are under scrutiny, there is an imminent threat, they need to take down this evil entity that's been bothering them. They're trying to break a curse that has been plaguing them for generations. But here he gives us the impression that he's a pro-feminist, and that this movie is to encourage women to see this movie like it'll change their lives forever. Or like he's trying to inspire them that if you can't take somebody down through physical force, use witchcraft. He might even be pro-Wiccan, for all we know. So instead of a superficial male feminist director, a tough-minded female director would have been better at telling this story. Yes, I completely agree. Maybe a movie of this caliber should have been at the hands of a female director to direct this movie, instead of a pro-male feminist type. If you want a movie about female empowerment, where was Greta Gerwig when we needed her? Or Patty Jenkins? Or Catherine Bigelow? they probably would have been the more better choice to direct this movie instead of, a guy who's hip with the female empowerment, girl power agenda like Griffin Dunne. A lot of people think that maybe what I just said was being sexist, but I actually turned the tables around and actually am encouraging a strong minded female director would have been much more suited to direct a movie of this caliber than some guy who's just hopping on the male feminist bandwagon just so he can get brownie points to say, oh, I'm hip with the girls. Dunne lubricates his movie by over-injecting a cornucopia of musical montages, especially during the scenes where Jillian gets away from the family to live a romantic life of sexual adventures, while Sally just wants to remain grounded and find a husband and start a family. Yes, I mean, you can see the contrary differences between Sally and Jillian Owens. Sally, she's, wants to be, in a monotonous relationship. And she did succeed. I mean, she married. She had 2 daughters. She also wanted to get away from witchcraft. She wanted to get away from chocolate cake for breakfast. Although I would have liked to had chocolate cake for breakfast. Maybe not as an everyday thing, but once in a while. Just to indulge in my sweet tooth. A little chocolate cake. Bring a glass of milk while you're at it. So that I can get a real good, better glance at the moistness. Okay. All kidding aside. Yeah. Of course, it's of course, not in her fault entirely, but of course, because of the whole curse that has been plaguing her family for generations, you feel bad for her. And then you have Jillian, who just wants to go out on wild, crazy sexual adventures because, she's the more free-spirited of the sisters. I always found Sally's story to be a little more interesting than Jillian's. Because you just feel so genuinely bad for Sally. So give credit, Dunne doesn't do that bad of a job directing. I'm not saying he did a bad job and all. I just felt that maybe a female director would have been a much more better choice of the two. Nothing against Griffin Dunne personally. He actually doesn't do a bad job of directing as he gives some great performances. We had some great supporting roles for Stockard Channing and Dianne Wiest as the 2 aunts, Frances and Jet. They were perfect in their positions, who can cast spells like no other. Man, did I also mention they also serve chocolate cake for breakfast? I'm kidding. That doesn't even... Yeah, they also provide some well-mannered comic relief. Hey, Dianne Wiest is an Oscar. I believe she won being in a Woody Allen movie. I think it was Bullets Over Broadway. I believe she was in that movie, and I think she actually had a nomination. Stockard Channing, she's been around a long time. They provide some really, really much needed comic relief in this movie, but they're also very, very effective in their roles as not only just, almost like parental figures to the Owens sisters, but they look out for them and they're always there for them. There's a lot of strong family unity with the Owens clan. And, I give them credit. They also did a fantastic job together. There's some great chemistry between them. It's a very good balance to see the 2 sisters with contrary perspectives and how they look at the world surrounding them. And while Kidman was excellent as the most laid back, with her wanting to go out on her own and find a path on her own and tempting a few guys along the way, it's a nice balance to have Bullock play Sally, who just wants to find happiness with a family of her own, but then faces heartbreak when her husband dies suddenly, and we feel for her as she struggles emotionally to win back her smile. Both churn out effective performances that shows that life can be enjoyable and heartbreaking at the same time. If there's one thing about the ending that I didn't like is suddenly they just, I mean, at first, at first glance you would say, okay, they seem to play more believable witches, meaning that they're not dressed in like the cliche witches things, sort of almost like the characters in the Witches of Eastwick. You're not seeing them wearing stereotypical witches stuff. But then at the end of Practical Magic, why is it all of a sudden they turn to a more cartoony edge near the end? I mean, even in the end, you see Sally and Jillian riding high on their broomsticks, and they're dressed in freaking cartoony witch apparel, complete with the black cloak, the Mary Jane shoes, the white and red striped stockings, the pointy witch hats. I mean, come on. I thought they were supposed to be more real life witches, but instead they made them out into these corny, cliche, cartoony type witches in the end, as they try to take down whatever evil that's been manifesting towards them and to break a curse. And then in the end, we turn out that we have this whole hocus pocus Disney cliche ending, which sort of like defeats the whole purpose of this movie by providing throughout most of the movie, throughout about 80% of the movie, we have a more realistic witch story drama. And then all of a sudden they decide to take away and just decide to go all cartoony like in the end. I mean, it just doesn't make sense and it defeats the narrative. So, that's kind of like where some of the biggest weaknesses in Practical Magic lies. I mean, no doubt. I'm not gonna say like this movie was bad. I mean, this movie was actually really good. Like I said before, originally, the good outweighs the bad in this movie. But there is a lot of weaknesses in this movie that I would like to point out. So, no doubt, about this. The chemistry within each performer is excellent in its deliveries. I have no problem with the acting. And the story of Jillian's Eastern European boyfriend stalking them and killing him by means of self-defense and burying him might capture a few moments of intrigue, albeit very cliched and very cartoony-like. This film definitely stands out as being not necessarily a classic, but still a good watch on a boring day. Maybe it might be something you could watch, during the Halloween season, or if you're bored and you have nothing to do, then I could practically suggest you watch Practical Magic. And through all the flaws, it's still a wonderful story to be told, and it still holds out well 22 years later. I know I pinpointed a lot of the weaknesses, being that it's cliched and the ending has a kind of a cartoony kind of thing going with them. And I didn't really mention too much about the villain character, because the villain character is far inferior compared to, like Jack Nicholson in The Witches of Eastwick, where he's just a scene stealer throughout. Even though the emphasis was based on the three witches, which were Alex, Jane, and Suki, Jack Nicholson just kind of outperformed them. In this movie, Practical Magic, the villain in this story, he is, weak, underdeveloped, and very drawn back. And yeah, okay, I know the story Practical Magic should emphasize mostly on the witches, but I could have preferred a little bit of a backstory on the villain as well. Really doesn't have very much to do or has very much appeal. In fact, he's practically forgettable. The movie has, of course, the more dramatic side to the Sandra Bullock story. We have the more romantic side to the Jillian story. The two aunts provide some well-needed comic relief. So there's a lot to really like about the movie. As for directing-wise, even though I strongly suggested that maybe a strong female director would have been the much more better choice for a movie of this caliber, I'm still give credence to Griffin Dunne for actually providing a great job, even though I think he was just trying to get in on the male feminist edge about him. But, still nonetheless, it's just a minor quib. Nothing personal. I just think he probably was sort of like the wrong choice to direct this movie, being that he's a male. A strong female director would have been the better choice. Somebody like a Greta Gerwig or a Patty Jenkins or a Catherine Bigelow. Maybe they probably would have been the more better selection for this type of movie. If they should do a Practical Magic reboot or a remake, maybe then we should really consider having a female director for this movie if they should do a Practical Magic remake. Maybe they might even should try and look for a much more convincing villain or villainous character to make at least the witches portrayed in this movie have a little more something to them, to their advantage, instead of just taking them down too easily. Things like that is what could have made this movie all the more better. So with all that said and done, if I was to give this movie a scale out of 10, I would give Practical Magic a 7.5 out of 10. I highly recommend you guys to see this movie. There's a lot in your expectation rates, but also at the same time, if you like a blend of witch fantasy movies, a little bit of horror, a little bit of comedy, a little bit of drama, a little bit of romance, you find them all pretty much here in this movie. And I think it does a great justice in doing the witch stuff, albeit, maybe a few cliches here and there. But everything seems to work out pretty good, so highly recommend it, you guys, all to see it. So I guess this ends my writer review. Thank you all for listening in. If you wish to subscribe to my channel, please feel free to do so. If you wish to leave a comment, go right ahead. But just remember the 3 simple rules. Be kind, be courteous, and please refrain from any rude comments. And I will be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is Eric Writer saying, keep watching those movies, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.